Just want to welcome you all. Just started the recording and I'm sure we're going to be seeing more people come into the room, but it's lovely to have you all here with us to invite a conversation today with Tim Chapman. And I'm your host, Molly Rowan Leach. It's a great pleasure and an honor to do this type of public session where we really get to dive in with some of our guides and way showers in the field of restorative justice and beyond in peace building and related areas, because there's so much cross integration of professions and process that can inform how we can optimize providing, as our topic today, a return to authentic voice, a return to authentic power in these practices we call restorative. And it really is, again, a pleasure and an honor to invite Tim Chapman into dialogue with us today and share his experiences, which really, from what I can tell in the few precious moments I've gotten some time in person with him and have observed and admired his work for many years, a lifelong dedication to this exploration on so many different levels. And so I'm going to go ahead and stop the screen share now and just welcome again those of you coming in. We're probably going to have more coming in as we go. We really want to let you know today that we'd love to interact with you and be lively together with Tim on the topic. And even if it's not along the topic, for you to have time to ask him questions and to be involved in the conversation as well. Before I welcome Tim more formally, I suppose, into this conversation, first of all, I just want to again acknowledge all of you. This is a global community that we've created together here. It's been going for, let's see, 13 years now. And oh, by the way, if you wouldn't mind, if you're not muted, if you just could mute your mic, that would be really helpful. Thank you. So as I was saying, restorative justice on the rise has been in motion for about almost 13 years now. It started at the outset of technology that allowed a global community to start coming together. So we really have been inspired and driven, myself, when I say we, it's myself and colleagues from all over the world who have been involved in, and we've only touched the tip of the iceberg really, in conversations around restorative justice and practices. And it was inspired by personal experiences that many of us, myself included, have had in being survivors of, in my case, my mother's 15-year incarceration here in the United States, which there was nothing to be said or known of an option called restorative justice. And from that, I began my own journey to question how can my own observations and experiences bring something of healing and awareness and advocacy. So that's how this advocacy platform and media platform and podcast was built. And it's certainly thanks to all of my teachers and guides, and including those who are no longer in this world, including Tanya Odoms, Andrea Brennicke from Seattle, Philip Helmick of the Shift Network, James O.D., grandmother Mona Polaka, and many others. So I think it's really important we remember that we're carrying forward something that so many, Tim included, have spent their lives exploring and serving in this field. So without further ado, oh, by the way, if you do want to check out the podcast, there's a multitude of conversations at restorativejusticesontherise.org. There's also this podcast will be posted there. It'll drop on iTunes as well as on Spotify. So just a few notes for those of you that might be joining us for the first time ever. Thanks for being here. So many of you probably are already familiar with Tim and his background. I thought it might be interesting, Tim, if instead of doing a formal introduction with you, let's have your perspective, if you wouldn't mind, and your story as to what brought you into restorative justice, and tell us a little bit about like what you'd like to make known, instead of it being, a formal introduction of you today.
Okay, thanks
Thank
very
you so
much, Mark.
much for being here. It's great to have you.
Well, it's a great honor to be invited. I'm very privileged to be able to share what I know with the people at this webinar. It's a great pleasure. I'm speaking to you from Ireland, the northern part of Ireland, Northern Ireland, and for about 30 years, I lived and worked through a period of extreme violent political conflict. And during that time, I was working as a probation officer. And I tended to choose to work in the most militant areas. I found them the most interesting. And so I guess one of the things when I think back on it, I probably wasn't conscious at the time, but I became very aware of how violence, whether it's from politically motivated armed groups or the state, abuse people's rights. I was very aware of the abuse of power through violence and other means were affecting the most underserved communities, particularly. As a probation officer, I was very aware that young people, particularly young men, were responding, and again, they had role models for violence. They were getting involved in crime because that seemed to be one of the few options were open to them. And the community itself responded in a very punitive way. I mean, in the areas that I worked with, young people who got themselves in conflict with the law and committed crimes were literally shot by armed groups as a punishment, not killed generally, but shot through their limbs. It was known locally as kneecapping because they tended to shoot them through their knees. And so I did my very best to work with these young people and adults as well, and to try and help them, get back to a decent life where they weren't harming others. And that at times made me unpopular in the community because I was seen as siding with the bad kids. And then I discovered restorative justice, and things seemed to fall into place because now I could work not only with perpetrators of harm, but victims of harm. And I could work in a way that I thought was consistent with a positive use of power and consistent with human rights. So once I discovered that, it wasn't long before I left the probation service and started getting trained in restorative justice, started practicing it. And that's really how I got into this business and this sort of movement.
So I just want to again acknowledge those of you that are coming in, and thank you, Tim, for that sharing of what inspired you to come into this field. And I've really appreciated all the work that you've guided, specifically, and we're going to talk today about some very specific pockets. But could you, if you'd be willing, talk a little bit about your leadership at the European Forum for Restorative Justice? For those of us that are coming in today from the United States, and then of course listening on the podcast, so many of us are very interested in what's going on in the EU right now, and what you've seen. So tell us a little bit more, if you would, about the EFRJ, and you served as the president for many years, I believe.
Yeah, the chair, we called it, the chair of the board.
Chair. Yes.
At about the same time as I was discovering restorative justice, the European Forum for Restorative Justice was being formed. It came out of an initiative and a sort of European international organization. All the European countries sign up to this. It's like a United Nations for Europe, the Council of Europe. And they asked a group of experts to advise them on a policy and a recommendation on mediation, victim offender mediation within criminal justice. And I wasn't involved in that, but that brought a group of experts from all over Europe to develop this policy for Europe. And they then decided, we're together, we have a lot in common. Let's set up this European Forum for Restorative Justice. So it was formed in the year 2000. In the meantime, I was working in Northern Ireland, developing the Restorative Justice program that had come out of the peace process. By now, we had a semblance of peace in Northern Ireland. And it was getting well known in Europe as a good example of restorative justice. And I was asked then if I would stand for election to the board around 2014, and was elected to the board, served a couple of years trying to understand how the forum worked. And then in 2016, I was elected for a 6-year term to be the chair of the board, and resigned in 2022. The European Forum is a network organization. It's a membership organization. It has individual members and it has organizational members. There's around 500 to 600 members altogether throughout Europe. Probably just about every country in Europe has people, and of course, people outside Europe can join. There's people from North America, Latin America, Asia, and Africa are also members. You don't have to be European. And one of the things I noticed was that it could activate its membership more. There was so much talent that particularly came out in our conferences, an amazing array of workshops and speakers. And so I felt we weren't fully activating our membership. So when I became chair, that was one of my missions, to activate membership and to, I suppose, deepen and broaden the scope of restorative justice beyond just the criminal justice system. And over the 6 years, we made, pretty good strides in that.
Tim, may I kindly interject?
Of course.
You said something so beautifully important about deepening restorative practices beyond the criminal justice system. Would you be willing to just say a quick little bit more about that for us?
Yeah.
What does that mean to you?
Well, let me give you concrete examples of what the European Forum is doing. We have, as I say, it's a membership organization. We encourage members to be active. And we do that through working groups and committees and the board and various projects, research projects. So about 20% of the membership, I say, are active, giving their time freely for the board. So to give you a quick rundown on the sort of work they're doing, we have working groups on gender-based violence. We have working groups on hate crime and polarization within society. Working groups on institutional abuse, which I'll probably talk about a bit later. What else have we got? We've got a training committee. We've got a publications committee, a quality, a values and standards committee in restorative justice. We have a committee for people working in education in schools using restorative practices. We have a restorative cities working group developing municipalities to become restorative. So that gives a flavor of spreading our wings a bit, and also using research and training and sort of process design to get deeper into the richness and potential of restorative justice.
Thank you so much. And my observation is just, just starting to begin of understanding what these working groups are all about that you just mentioned. But I'm noticing that There's global participation. People can submit
Mhm.
interest in a working group if you're a
Yeah,
member of the
yeah.
EFRJ or
We have Americans
yeah.
participate in working groups.
So so
So
it's quite wonderful, and really
mm,
appreciate the depth of that work.
mm.
And in edges, I believe, of the field, really. It looks like you're really exploring the edges of the field in these working groups, which is very important.
Yes, yeah. I think, yeah, the edges, the margins, but also
Mm-hmm.
staying true to the core principles and values of restorative justice.
Mm-hmm.
But I think one of the things, and I think it's a theme for this evening, is a lot of those working groups, when you think of gender-based violence, um, institutional abuse, is looking at power, looking at the abuse of power. And I think that's one of the core things that's emerging from the European scene, the need to challenge abuse of power through restorative means and to empower those who are being, suffering injustice.
I would love to go right into that because that's such a big piece of what I'm guessing a lot of us have come together today live to hear from you about, is how do we really go into that, and what does that look like? I mean, I think we all know and can imagine what you've seen in Northern Ireland and all over the world, probably, with the work that you've done. So what does this really mean? I mean, let's just go for it. Let's talk about
Mm,
our topic. Um,
yeah. Um, well, let me start firstly talk a little bit about the research I've done, because I find, I came from a criminal justice background. And so my first sort of, I suppose, priority was to try and support people who had committed harmful acts, to sort out whatever it was in their lives that was making them do that, and to get a better life and become, stronger, more responsible citizens. And the model we developed in Northern Ireland, we called it the balance model. It was really taken from work that had been done in the States, balancing the interests and needs of victims and offenders in the community. So I always thought I was balanced until I started some research into victims of serious crime who'd experienced restorative justice, and realized that I had a lot of unconscious bias in favor of perpetrators of harm, just because I'd worked in a system that was very focused on offenders rather than victims. And that taught me a lot. It taught me about both the vulnerability of victims, but also their strength and courage. It taught me that what was important about restorative justice is not what we do. And I think I spent a lot of time as a trainer talking about what we should do, what good practice was, etc. It made me reframe that into what restorative justice is about, is what it enables ordinary people to do. And victims sort of taught me that, because the approach I took was a very narrative approach. I just asked them to tell me their story. I didn't have questions or theories to prove. And they showed me how that way before they knew what restorative justice was or met anybody who practiced it, they were trying to restore themselves. There's something within us that wants to restore ourselves when something bad has happened, or even when we've done something bad. And so, and became a greater appreciation that the importance of their stories and their agency. It was humbling, because when they got to talk about the restorative experience, I mean, they were very positive about it, but they didn't go into a lot of detail, all the sort of stuff I teach. The thing they said mainly was it was great to have a practitioner to do the heavy lifting. That was their expression. And I wasn't sure what that meant. I think it meant you need that practitioner to do the things you can't do, to organize it, facilitate it, get the room, get the time, get the protocol in place. But the actual important work, the actual restorative practice was done by the participants of the process, not the practitioner. And so that was the first thing I took away in relation to that research, that we need to be careful about our own power and not get too full of ourselves. That humility is probably one of the best qualities of a good practitioner, and almost to make ourselves and our method invisible so that they feel they are doing the work, they are achieving what matters to them.
That's such a powerful point. I thank you. If you don't mind, thank you for stating that. As we move in this field, no matter where we are in the world, I'm observing for myself and for maybe many of us that that we might tend to feel that it's all on us to drive it forward. And yet that contradicts the wisdom of the circle, the wisdom of the individual, and the true essence is, if I'm hearing you correctly, that's what you're saying, that the essence of restorative practice is really for us that are offering to help guide it is not unlike what our friend Dominic Barter would say, and that's that the facilitator ideally disappears to some degree. There's a disappearance to some degree, although they're still there to help guide.
Yeah, but it's important. I mean, the facilitator is very important, but not to get carried away that we're the hero of the story.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, the metaphor I use in my teaching is we're the scaffolders. We provide the scaffolding that creates the strong, safe platforms on which ordinary people can do risky and difficult work. Just like, you've got to climb up a huge building to fix a crack in the wall or something. It's scary and it's difficult. So you need a safe platform in order to do that work. So the participants do the work, but we build the scaffolding around them so it's safe and they can get on with it. And I think what we're doing is releasing that, which I think is in all of us, that, as I said earlier, that impulse to restore ourselves if we get hurt, and our own just intelligence and ability to enter into dialogue with others and discover solutions, rather than always looking to the expert to say, what's wrong with me and what should I do? Can you give me a cure?
So I just want to welcome everybody's voice into this conversation at this point. And if not already, hopefully you have that sense that even though it's just my screen and Tim's in view, we really feel you here and welcome you here as a conversation community, and would love to invite your questions in the chat. And if you have a question right now about what we're diving into together, would love to welcome that right now. So if you do have a question, you could raise your hand and then I can help you open your mic if that's needed. And while we're in this space of allowing a pause for your thoughts to come forward, I'd just love to announce too that we'll be talking a bit about Tim's upcoming book in a little bit. You have a book that you're working on. And for those of you who are curious, this podcast will be dropped on iTunes and Spotify, as well as a video on our YouTube channel. That's Restorative Justice on the Rise YouTube channel. So we'll keep going, but if anyone would like to chime in at this point, let's just keep it kind of in a flow where you don't have to feel shy. If you're here and you have a question, just chime in, please, by all means.
Yes, I would welcome that.
Yes. So Tim, one of the things that maybe we could return to for a moment is around your experiences in Northern Ireland and the aspects of, and we'll come back to you, Ellen, in just a moment. Thank you for that. I'm watching the chat. Um, when we're thinking about what we might call high level violence and even intergenerational, cross cultural traumas that are long standing. What are you finding around how that relates to restorative justice and root cause and core?
Yeah, it's interesting you raise that. I had a conversation with a practitioner working in an area where there had been a lot of violence during our political conflict. And she was asking me if I would do some training in more complex work with her project. And I was saying, well, so how do you define complex work? And she gave me an interesting example. She says, we're now having people knock on our door who were, we call them ex-combatants. They have been called by other people as ex-terrorists or violent extremists. People who have, for political motivations, committed acts of violence to further their cause during our conflict. And they're coming now 20 years after peace was declared to say they're suffering from post-traumatic stress and they're dealing with deep feelings of guilt and shame about what they've done. And they're finding it's affecting their mental well-being. And they want to have some sort of restorative process that might give them some sense of peace. Because although the war may be over, there's still something going on inside them. They're still fighting that war and fighting, I suppose, their conscience about what they did, the suffering they caused to others, and whether it was all worth it. We have made political progress in our country, but was it worth nearly 4,000 people being killed? For that, a lot of people are dealing with the aftermath of political violence, and victims, of course, as well, who still have never received justice, have never received the truth of what happened to their loved ones when they were killed, what the motivation for killing them was. So you can see how restorative processes can help in a sort of post-conflict situation to help people. Politicians can declare peace and sign peace treaties and change, reform, structures of government. But that doesn't have a huge impact on the relationships on the ground and the grief and the guilt and the shame and the anger that is left after a political conflict. And I think that's where we can do something really useful. Wherever there has been terrible things happen, sometimes we feel a bit powerless while it's happening. When you look at Ukraine, you look at Israel, Gaza, it just seems so horrible. And, what can we do? But I think we come in afterwards to repair the things that can't be repaired politically or even medically, but it's about relational, it's about values, it's about trauma. And I think we have a major contribution in societies to do that.
Thank you so much, Tim. And I'd love to come over to the chat where I'm seeing some questions here from our community today. And I know that quite a few have come in, but I would like to give proper honor to Michael Nagler and the Meta Center for Nonviolence. Michael, if you would like to ask your question with your voice and video, please do so. Again, the Meta Center for Nonviolence, maybe the two of you are acquainted. It's wonderful to see you, Michael.
It's so nice to see you, Molly. It's been quite a while.
It has been too long.
Yeah. Tim, I just wanted to ask you whether you have been working any with the concept of moral injury. I actually have two questions. That is the first. Do you work with moral injury? And if you want to address that a little bit, I'll
Yeah.
share my second one later.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Michael, and it's a pleasure to meet you. Um, I yes is the answer to that. When I started off, I don't know if other people were like this. When I started off in restorative justice, I was very focused on method.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what's the correct process? What is it? Are we mediators? Are we, restorative conferences or circles? As I've got more experience and listened to people, I'm more I'm more interested in defining the processes that I practice and teach as value led,
Mm-hmm.
based on certain principles, and you listen to the participants when they come to you and work out what is the best way that we can together design a process that will resolve it. And I connect that with moral injury because quite often one of the questions or one of the things I'm searching for when I first meet a victim or a perpetrator is not just what happened and the impact of what happened, but what really matters to you. And usually that comes down to some violation of a sort of sacred value that they hold, like dignity,
Mm-hmm.
like solidarity. What do we owe our fellow citizens, and has that been breached by this act? Justice, the fact that I've suffered an injustice, truth. These So if I'm understanding you right, I think those are how people experience moral injury. They feel that something they believe in, a moral or a value or an ethic, has been trodden upon without any respect and sensitivity, and that needs to be repaired. That they need that restored. They need a process which recognizes, acknowledges that their dignity has been trodden on, and a process that helps them restore that dignity. And we as practitioners need to be exemplifying those values for them throughout the process. And, and I don't know if you want me to talk at the moment, Molly, about the work I'm doing with the Catholic Church, but there's certainly moral injury in the practice I'm involved in, a major project of institutional child sexual abuse. Within the Catholic Church and the schools that they ran in Ireland. But I might come back to that because it brings, I think, moral injury and abuse of power into focus in a very concrete way. But I don't know if that answers your question, Michael. Is that?
It certainly does, Tim. Thank you very much.
You had another one you
I
wanted?
do. Yeah. Thank you for remembering. Yeah. Yeah. It's been my observation since the original Truth and Reconciliation process in South Africa that a lot of restorative work omits a critical component, which is to enable the perpetrators in particular, not just to confess, but to do something.
Mm-hmm.
Classic example here in the US would be some white people burned down a black church some years ago, and they were uh, ordered by the judge. The sentence passed on them was to rebuild that church, and that struck me as like a necessary component to actually get in and do some restoration and not just the change of heart that you think you have gone through. So I'd
Yeah,
love to hear your comment on that.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think there's a danger of restorative justice being diluted,
Mhm.
and the justice part of it taken out. Now, I'm not going to argue for punishment but there's no doubt. I mean, in my research in victims, I've yet to meet a victim of serious crime who argued that the guy shouldn't have gone to prison. But what they say is, that doesn't bring me closure.
Right.
And it's the moral injury hasn't been addressed. Their voice hasn't been heard. And some restorative processes go the other way. They're about sort of, empathy, all good things, empathy, apology, forgiveness. But I quite like a victim to say, you're saying you're sorry. I want you to show me it. Not just words. Words are easy. I want those words to have the power to translate into action. And that could be, I need some compensation or material reparation here, or I need to see you do something that proves to me you've learned something from this process. You're going to change your life. So I'm a great believer. I mean, our system in Northern Ireland was quite radical in that every young person under the age of 18 who admits to a criminal offence will be offered restorative justice.
Oh.
It's not the judge decides or the prosecutor decides or the social worker decides. They will be offered, and it'll happen if they say, yes, I'll do that. And 9 times out of 10, they say yes.
Yeah.
And we've had tens of thousands of conferences. We're a small country of 1.8 million. I estimate about 1 person in 20 in Northern Ireland has been at a restorative conference now. It's just normal. We've been at it for over 20 years. And so it's just, at first there was lots of resistance. This is soft, but I think we made it quite tough. And I don't mean tough in a punitive sense. I just think demanding of the perpetrator. It's tough for the victim too, to walk into the room and say what she or he wants to say. So I think, yes, action speaks louder than words. I think what we sometimes say, it's the meeting that does everything. I believe it's what happens after the meeting that creates the outcome. The meeting is the springboard. It's the opportunity to come up with an agreement. What do we do to clear up this mess? And what particularly does the perpetrator owe? What obligation does he owe? And that's, I think, really good for the perpetrator, because it seems to me that if you commit a harmful act, there's 2 problems. 1, you've got to answer for it. You've got to be accountable. But 2, in our society, and I suspect America's not that different, offenders find it very difficult to shake the reputation, the stigma, the label. So I think they have to show, I'm going to demonstrate that I want to do the right thing and I want to be a good citizen. So I think, that example you gave of, rebuild that church is a good example of reparation and restoration.
Well, thank you so much, Tim. That enlarges my understanding of the issue. Actually, I'm very grateful. Thank you. And of course, I'm glad that you agree.
Michael, thank you so much for being willing to come into the visual room here with us today, and for being here, and for all that you do with the Meta Center for Nonviolence, which is quite a global force of its own, of commitment to nonviolence in true ways. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, really.
Oh,
Yeah.
well, Molly, from you, that is very confirming indeed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I did put the website for the Meta Center for Nonviolence in the chat for those of you that might be interested in learning more. And I'd love to just shift gears for a moment and come back to more questions from our lovely community here. But I'd like to make an announcement that kind of ties into our conversation today. And that's that there is a conference coming up in Tallinn, Estonia, that the European Forum for Restorative Justice is hosting from the 29th of May until the 31st, including a workshop on the 28th of May. Again, that's in Tallinn, Estonia, and the theme is called is focusing on just times Restorative Justice Responses in Dark Times. And what a lovely convening and opportunity to take a week to delve into these conversations very deeply. And as Tim described earlier, incredible breakouts, incredible opportunities to learn from people all over the world along this theme. So thank you, Tim, for being involved in that and for making it known how welcome and included people are from all over the world. I've had the experience and honor of being at an event or two and have really felt that way coming from the States and have learned a lot. So thank you. The registration can be found at euforumrj.org. For those of you that may not be aware of the EFRJ's website, that's euforumrj.org. And registration is now open. So let's come back. Nicodemus, I wanted to come to you, if I may, and invite you if you'd like to ask your question live, whether it's on camera or off, or I can certainly have, yes, great. There he is. Great to see you, Nicodemus. Welcome.
Great to see you too. Hi, Tim. Nice to meet you. Thanks for this powerful conversation. I'm honored to be able to witness and experience it. Tim, something you said early on in your conversation when you were talking about some of your own personal work that you were doing around unconscious bias really struck me. And I hear many of my colleagues talk about doing that work of unconscious bias. I'm wondering if you would be willing, if you wouldn't mind sharing a few of the insights or takeaways on some of that work that you think might be beneficial to others that might be doing that work along the way. Thank you.
Yeah. Let me see if I can remember some examples to make it real. It started to come to me when I had really deep listening with victims. And by that, I would mean I would contact a victim. They usually had experienced serious harm. And all I would say is, please tell me what you want me to know about what happened. And some would talk for 40 minutes, some would talk for nearly 2 hours, and I said nothing, took notes, recorded it. It was quite often done on Zoom. And then in the end, I would say, you've made some interesting points. Could I just ask you a bit more about that? Now, some of the things that came out of that confounded me, well, let me start with a sort of golden rule that I had. When working with a victim of serious crime, really avoid anything that might re-traumatize, okay? So on several occasions, we've talked at the end of their story about the trauma, and they'd experienced really bad trauma, all the symptoms you would expect. And I said, you know, you were sort of so persistent in trying to find a way of having a conversation with your perpetrator. Surely that was re-traumatizing you, because not only were they still suffering from the trauma of the crime, but they were being re-traumatized by people's reactions to them when they sought help, you know, when they were pushed back by the police or other organizations, the victims' organizations, the people they went to say, I need help and I want to talk to this guy who did this to me. They would be treated with a sort of paternalistic sympathy. Oh no, I don't think that would be a good idea. But you're not listening to me. I need to do this. And I'm just sort of thinking, if I had been behind that desk when they came in, maybe I would have said that, you know, I think this would be re-traumatizing. You're too vulnerable. And when I actually had an honest conversation, I said, you know, I would have said, if you go along this path, you're going to get re-traumatized. And, you know, victims on several occasions said, yes, and I was. But you know what? It was worth it. And what I had sort of focused, I suppose, in my view of victims was on their vulnerability, their weakness, their need for protection, their need for safety, which is all true. But I hadn't focused on their strengths. I hadn't seen them as whole people, if you know what I mean. You know, I just focused on one part of them. And What I do now is when I'm working with a victim or a perpetrator, and it applies to both parties, I make very little distinction, to tell you the truth. They're human beings. When I listen to the story, I use a process which helps me understand what really matters to this person. And if I know what really matters to them, then I can offer them something that will support them to get what really matters, to get it addressed. And time and again, victims have said, yes, that is what really matters. And I don't care if I feel the pain, because it matters so much to me to free myself from this question, or this need to find out the truth, or this need to face the perpetrator who raped me and said, to tell him, you did not destroy me. I feel no shame. You should feel shame. I underestimated courage, strength, even and compassion within victims, because I had them in a sort of stereotypical view of victimhood. And I suppose I didn't think I needed to design the process to accommodate them. I think unconsciously I had a process which was about rehabilitating the perpetrator, restoring the perpetrator. I wouldn't have admitted that until I heard it from the victim, you know. The whole lot of things that they told me in my research really confounded basic things, you know, like there's a famous case where the facilitator came to tell the victim the meeting was set up, it was going to happen within a week or two. Said, I have to tell you this, I've just had a conversation with the perpetrator. This is the man who raped you. And he's told me he's not sorry. He doesn't regret it. Don't expect an apology. Now, he will listen to your story. He will answer your questions truthfully. But he's not going to apologize. Now, that confounded me. I think in the past I would have said, well, the game's off. This is going to stop. The victim, then I said to the victim, so what did you do? She said, I've been preparing for this meeting for months, and it never struck me that one of my objectives of this meeting was to get an apology. It didn't matter to her. Now, for other victims, it could have been the thing that mattered. But for her, it didn't matter. I want to show him that he hasn't destroyed me, that I have power and agency. And she further explained, if I had said to him, no, in that case, if you're not going to apologize to me, I'm not going to meet you. She said to me, she looked me in the face and said, who has the power? He's still calling the shots. Just like when he raped me in a field, when he had total control over me, I will never let him have control over me. So though that really opened up my eyes to the dynamics of power, imbalances of power, and the victims, the importance to a victim to regain power, regain agency over their lives, whether it's over the perpetrator or over the trauma that they're suffering, which often takes away agency and drives their lives rather than their own choices. I don't know if that answers your question. That was just what first came to mind about it. I had a lot of assumptions that were challenged when I actually listened to people without any filters, just listened, not trying to tick a box or do an assessment or prove a theory. Just listen to another human being. And then you suddenly think, oh my goodness, I have been generalizing so much.
That was, yes, definitely answered and responded to the questions. And I appreciate you sharing the specific examples and being honest about the assumptions that we can sometimes make. And it sounds like by recognizing others' power through the listening, that you are also able to recognize the power that you were giving them in the same sense, which is like a really beautiful way of being and being in space with people. So thank you for allowing me to jump in.
Yeah, if I can just say one thing, I resist that notion of we're giving people power. I think we're just releasing the power that people have. You know, that's the heavy lifting, if you like. We're going to create a context and an opportunity where you can be powerful when before you were overpowered by somebody else. So I don't think I have power to give, but I have opportunities to create where they can feel full life.
I appreciate that reframing. Yeah, thank you for that.
I talked to a young girl again who'd been raped, and she said she couldn't believe the power she had in the meeting because she, you know, the ground rule was, and I'm sure you'd be aware that, you know, you don't interrupt people. You wait till they finish before you speak, and you listen. And she found power just coming back to her because she was able to face the rapist and say what he'd done to her, the impact, and what was wrong with what he'd done. And he couldn't say anything because actually this was a rape between people who knew each other, and he'd always dominated her. She could never speak without him slapping her down. And so this restorative, you know, meeting opportunity allowed her to speak for nearly an hour, and he couldn't say anything. And she said that felt amazing. And then he had his opportunity to speak.
Just when I hear those stories, I just think of the amazing courage that it must require of the individual and the person to face that. And in some ways, it provides a space to let us know that we can be courageous too.
I think so. I think we have it in us. I think what the practitioner does is, and I think I put a lot of emphasis into preparation for meetings and making sure the meeting's safe, but it's trying to draw out that courage that we all have, but often, you know, we're afraid of. We're discouraged rather than encouraged. So I think it's a wonderful practice. I love it because you see the humanity in everyone, even the people who've done horrible things. Their ability to show compassion and courage, and you know, and just curiosity about other people, not making judgments, asking questions, and wondering what makes them different or the same as us.
Good. Thanks so much for letting me hop in here, Molly, and thanks for holding the space. Tim, nice meeting you. I'll drop off and allow someone else to join the conversation. But thanks so much for engaging. I appreciate it.
A pleasure to meet you.
It's wonderful to see you, Nicodemus. Thank you so much for that. And just a quick note, Tim, I believe you had given us permission to have you for a little bit over the typical hour podcast conversation today. Is that still standing as a gift to us to have you for?
Absolutely.
Okay, lovely.
I'm getting
so I just want to give people clarity that if they would like to stay with us for, I think we agreed on until the next half hour. Is that correct? So that we're going for another maybe 15 to 30 minutes, depending on if we cover the questions that are in the chat and everything. Would that work for you? I don't want to keep you too long, but we have a lot of great questions. And we also had thought about diving a little bit more specifically into your discoveries around the Catholic Church and, you know, the pieces of, around trauma. And I wanted to talk a little bit too about the domestic violence restorative justice training you just conducted. So, but on that note, there is a question up here from John that might kind of take us into a deeper direction around the church and what you might like to talk with us about. So John, if you would be willing, and certainly not a requirement, to join us by voice or video or both to ask your question.
Wait a minute. Sorry, I had my stuff turned off. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes,
I can hear you,
welcome.
John.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'm Native American, joining you from New Mexico here in the United States. In my mother's language, we greet someone by saying Kawatsi. In my father's language, we greet another by saying Ashui. And certainly for the many indigenous peoples, especially of the Southwest, we have always had the historical um, record of the encroachment of um, invaders and colonists, but they were led primarily and justified through the Catholic Church. That was really the purpose of the colonization of the Americas, was certainly the expansion of the kingdom of Castile and Aragon, but eventually then certainly to bring into the Catholic fold the indigenous peoples. But to do that, you have to accept them as human beings, because you don't, at the time, the Catholic Church wasn't indoctrinating Jews, Muslims, gypsies, gays, lesbians, Saracens. Anybody that was not seen worthy of the Catholic faith was being persecuted, because that was at the time of the Spanish Inquisition. But to then work toward Christianizing them, you have to accept them as human beings. So my question, or would like to perhaps get your perspective of, is when we think about crimes against humanity, you talked about rape, you talked about terrorism, and all of these things that human beings do to one another, but when it's justified and or institutionalized by a religion, by a dogma, to say those guys over there don't believe less like we do, but I can still be justified in doing what I do to another group, simply because my belief systems, my existential constructs justify me to do that, because I'm doing the work of my belief system. So I would just like to see, perhaps maybe hear from you what your perspective is.
Yeah.
And thank you.
Thank you, John, for
Thank
an
you, John.
important and complex question that I can really not do justice to in a short time, but I'll try just to answer honestly. I suppose as I was listening to you, I was thinking about a lot of things. My childhood was spent in Nigeria. My father was a colonialist. At that time, I had a very happy childhood in Nigeria. And Nigeria was part of the British Empire. And I became, I still have a strong affection for Nigeria. And when I meet Nigerians, I can see how imperialism has really damaged the indigenous culture and way of living together and governing their own land, and has held them back in many ways. It hasn't helped them to develop, although they're resource rich and now have independence. They're still a very divided and troubled nation because of the legacy that the British left. I live in Ireland, which again was a British colony, and we have been divided and left to fight it out amongst ourselves, again by colonization. And it has a lasting effect. It's a lasting traumatic effect on a nation and on peoples. And I mean, all I can do is these sort of random sort of observations. Now I'm working on a major restorative project within the Catholic Church in Ireland, which brings me back to your starting point. And I recognize a lot of what you say. I'll just explain the project briefly and then maybe draw out some of the points that may be relevant to your question. I was approached just over 2 years ago by a group of victims of child sexual abuse. They were men of my age and looked like me, talked like me, had were well educated, quite privileged white men, but they'd been abused by Catholic priests when they were at school about 40 years ago. And they wanted me to see if I could facilitate restorative meetings between the victims and the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. Because at the time, the church, it's come out, you know, the Catholic Church used to be the most powerful institution in Ireland. It's no longer. And in a way, it's a tragedy for the church, because there's been many instances of abuse committed within the church, and their initial approach was to cover it up. I think this has happened also in America, to cover it up and to tell the victims they were liars. Religious people wouldn't do that, or to pay them off money and get them to sign non-disclosure agreements. As always happens in a free society, these things come to the surface anyway. And the Catholic Church has lost a lot of its moral authority in Ireland, having been one of the most Catholic countries in the world. And so I've come into this when the Catholic Church are now more open to being accountable. But that doesn't mean they're totally open to it, because they have been, as you say, a very powerful institution for at least two millennia. And they are riven with, again, what I would call unconscious bias. Sometimes they don't know that they are imposing power on other people because they've just been doing it for so long. It's sort of invisible to them. But when you're a victim, you see it very clearly, what is going on. So although this project has gone reasonably well, it's interesting to me that the victims, the way I have, or I prepare victims, and they're deeply traumatized by this, as you can imagine, being, you know, raped by a mature man when you're 8 years old or 10 years old. And I'm sorry if I'm triggering anybody. Please take care of yourself if I am. Sorry, I'm just losing my train. The victims will come after a lot of preparation by me, will be ready to tell their story. And they will tell it, and it is often quite painful. And again, I would go back to the point I made earlier. They are willing to take on the re-traumatization in order to have their voice heard. They don't want to be protected. They want to take a stand in front of power. And to give the representatives of the church now their credit, they turn up for the meetings, they listen, they respond compassionately. They say something very important to victims, which they hadn't heard before. We believe you. You were an innocent child, and our priest was the guilty person, 100%. So do not be ashamed. A lot of these men have carried shame for many, many years. And they will say, we will, if you would like, we will give you a written apology, personal, about what happened to you. And we can pay for therapy for you. So that first part of the meeting is very compassionate. It's very healing. And I can see victims get a lot from that, a lot of comfort and peace from that. But then the victim wants to know what happened to the priest. Why did you not stop him from abusing children? Why did he not end up in prison like other sex offenders? Why did you, at that time, 40 years ago, feel it was more important to protect priests than to protect innocent children? Then it gets uncomfortable because power is being challenged. And then they might go on to say, and what are you going to do to pay back? A bit like Michael's question, the very first question. You've said you're sorry, but does that mean anything in action? What are you going to change in the system? And what sort of payback do I get for the suffering I've experienced for the last 40 years? And they have terrible stuff. It's terrible loss of innocence, loss of faith, because their religion is being violated by those who are meant to be protecting the religion. And again, what the church says is you'll need to get your lawyers to speak to our lawyers. And suddenly you're out of the restorative space. You're into the real world of power and sort of corporate responsibility or not. And it's only after we've done about 40 of these meetings, and it's only recently that the hierarchy are realizing this isn't good. We are re-traumatizing unnecessarily victims by putting them through litigation, because they will have smart lawyers that will try and, challenge the story. In the restorative process, they're believed, but lawyers are not paid to believe everything. They want evidence, and they want to be able to challenge evidence. And so it gets very messy. So it gets about 70% of the way there, and then you hit power. And that's, I guess, one of the themes of tonight. This is more and more I'm seeing this use of power. And I don't know if you speak this way, but a lot of restorative people in Britain and Ireland talk about the power of relationships. And I think that's true. But there's also relationships of power. And that increasingly is what I'm working with, whether it's in gender, institutional power, patriarchal power, racist power, heterosexist power, all sorts of forms of power. A lot of the time it seems invisible until you're the victim of it, and then it's very visible and very tangible. And I think restorative justice practice needs to engage with this in a robust, not in a punitive, necessarily adversarial way, but in a way that helps those in power understand how they are abusing their power, but also helps the victims of injustice to undo the injustices they're experiencing. And I think that, and as I get older and more experienced, that becomes clearer to me. Whether I'm right or wrong, I'm not sure, but that's where I'm at. It's a long, rambling answer to you, John. I'm sure it doesn't hit all the points you made, but I appreciate your question. I think what you said was very legitimate. And it's a problem throughout the world at the moment that we're dealing with, post-colonialism. And it's in the Middle East, it's in Asia, it's in Africa, it's in Europe, and it's in America. It's an unfortunate result of our past.
Well, thank you. And it probably only exists because it's a human issue. Thank you again.
Thank you, John.
Thank you so much, John, for being willing to voice in. I really, really appreciate it as well, and hope that honors for everybody else that we still have questions from. Just wanting to reiterate your choice as to whether you might like to voice it or on camera. But Tim, with the time that we have together still, would you like to share a little bit more before we go back to questions from the community about your upcoming book? Or should we just stay on I mean, this is such a powerful space that we're in right now, so I don't want to interrupt that either.
I can say right at the end, if you like. I'll just say, this is the title. It'll be coming out soon.
Okay.
I'm more interested in the questions, I must say.
Let's do that. Thank you. So I'd like to honor kind of along the thread that we're on already, but there are some questions up in the queue as well that haven't been addressed around holding space as a facilitator and so forth. So please don't worry, we're coming to you. as best we can and haven't forgotten about you. Laura, thank you. Would you like to voice in about your question about the voices of victims?
Sure, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I really appreciated all of the different comments that you've made with respect to hearing deeply the voices of victims. And I'm curious about concepts like victim-centeredness and trauma-informed practice and your thoughts about them in relation to restorative justice practice.
Yeah. It's sort of sounding as a bit of a hobby horse to me, but by now, in doing victim-centered work, I want them to know that every step of the process they're in control of. You know, it's changed my vocabulary, it's changed my approach in many ways. You know, for instance, we would always say, you know, you must seek the consent of the victim to participate in a restorative process. I now would frame it as I ask the permission of the victim to be part of the flow of their life at the moment for a short while to see if I can help in any way. So I'm not looking for their consent, I'm looking for their permission to be of use, to be of service to them. So I try to honor their authority over their life, their reality, their narrative, as opposed to come in as the expert who can somehow shape their story into a better shape than they have it in. And that's what I've been taught by victims. And I think when I do that, they get much more engaged and much more open and will talk much more. You know, so many of these men who've been abused have told me, you are the first person I've told, you know, this happened 40 years, I've carried it, you're the first person ever. It's such a privilege, but you have to create that sort of space for them. I'm sure you're all aware of that, but I bend over backwards to say, this is your story, your choice, your voice. I just am here to help you make those choices, use your voice to address what really matters to you, because I don't know you well enough to know what's important to you. You need to educate me. Once I know what is important, then maybe I have a few ideas of how we could create the opportunity for you to say, ask, request, whatever it is you want from whoever you want to make those requests to. So I think I've learned to go at the right pace with people, not to push them. There's some people who are anxious to have a meeting, and you know, maybe I'll have just 2 preparatory meetings with them and they're ready to go. There's one who's just like that now. He's put a lot of thought, he's had therapy, he doesn't need that much more work from me, and he's ready to go. There's another guy I'm meeting tomorrow morning, and I've been meeting him for over a year, preparing him, and he's nearly there. One of the indicators that he was nearly there 2 weeks ago was he got really angry and then apologized, said, I'm embarrassed. I said, don't be embarrassed. What happened to you was unjust. Anger is an appropriate response. So we're getting there, that you're now allowing yourself to be angry about it. Before, shame was the prevailing emotion, and fear and anxiety. So it's pace, it's choice, it's taking great care that you're seeking permission at every stage of the way, taking great care to be able to feed back what you're hearing from somebody. That's something I learned from Dominic Barter. Let me see if I understand you. You've just told me this is that. And to do it in such a way that they can contradict you. You say, no, you haven't got it right, or you've missed this bit out. So I am, you know, really on the same page. I'm not trying to give an interpretation or an assessment or tell them what's wrong with them or give them a theory. I'm honoring their narrative, their life, that is, I need to show a reverence for that. In the past, I can't say I think I had a certain professional arrogance that I knew better than ordinary people. Now I really work on my humility, which doesn't necessarily come easy to me. So those are some of the things in victim centered. And then when it comes close to having a meeting, I now call it co-designing. I have a model that I call the 7 Ps. What are the 7 things that begin with P that should be at a meeting? And obviously there's people with purpose. There's a place. There's, I couldn't think of a word in English begin with P that meant time. So I've got period. What period of time will it take? When will it be? How will the process be designed? You know, who will speak first? Who will speak next? I used to have a structure for that. Now I let the participants decide. What are the protocols? That's a word beginning with P that I used to use for ground rules. So now a protocol. What preparation and support do people need? And the final P is the practitioner. This was taught to me by a victim. She'd been a victim of rape again and wanted to meet the person who raped her, and was being supported by somebody who said, I have the very practitioner, very good. They went to meet the practitioner, and the woman at the end of it, she decided she didn't want him to be the practitioner, to be the facilitator. And she said to this woman who'd really helped her and had found this practitioner who her friend really valued, said, I don't feel safe with him. And the other woman said, that's okay, we'll find another one. And the victim, reported to me, that's when I felt I was being restored. I was being treated like an adult who could make choices, and I wouldn't have to, explain my choice. And I often wonder, well, what I would have said if that had happened. But now when I'm working at a certain stage of the preparation, I will say, let's talk about me, Tim Chapman. How do you feel about me facilitating the meeting? And I give you complete permission to say, I prefer somebody else. Maybe I prefer a female or somebody closer to my culture. And that's okay. We'll find somebody. And so it's every step of the way, particularly for victims, but I do the same for perpetrators. Respecting their choice. It's your process. It's your life. It's your trauma. It's your harm that you committed or have suffered. I'm not here to take possession of that and mold it into a restorative package. It's you. You are the person at the center of this, not me. You are the hero of your own story, not me. So that I don't know if that gives you a glimpse into the sort of practices I would use and teach others. Thank you for the question, Lara.
Thank you, Lara.
Thanks so much. Appreciate that.
Lara, do you feel complete with your question? And did you have anything further you'd like to make known or inquire about?
If I could just sort of go one little step further, because these are really, really excellent inputs about sort of how to be victim centered. What I have found, I guess, is that there's still a question about whether that's even appropriate, whether that's even a good way to approach restorative justice. And so I'd be curious about if you were in a conversation with someone and you were trying to speak to sort of the needs of victims, what you might say to them about why this is important.
Why this approach I was describing is important.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's a really good, challenging question. It's making me think. I mean, what I notice about both the injustice that the victim has experienced and the trauma that has resulted from that injustice is a loss of power, a loss of control. the offense is often the imposition of somebody else's power on you for their needs, without any respect for your needs, your emotions, your values, your rights. And that's what is so destructive of crime and harmful behavior. And then the trauma comes along and starts to drive you into a sort of defensive reaction to the pain, the fears, and all the things that we know that trauma, creates for us. And often those defense mechanisms become the problem themselves. So many men I'm meeting now are using cocaine, alcohol, various sex addiction in order to deal with their trauma. And that becomes the problem. That's driving their lives, this sort of compulsive behavior. So for me, the reason I take this is I want you to feel you can restore your own power over your own life, to regain control, and to follow some sort of path of recovery. I quite like Judith Herman's approach. So I tend to work along that path with them, safety, getting a coherent narrative that you can integrate within your life, that it gives meaning and some meaning to what happened, however horrible, and reconnecting with community and with relationships. And finally, in our latest book, getting justice. So I think that the two things are very connected. It's about people getting back control. And that's why, as I say, no victim has ever complained about punishment or imprisonment, but it doesn't help them regain control over their lives. I've not had, as I say, I've never had a victim complain about a prison sentence, but I've never said, okay, I've never heard anyone say, that's my problem's over. He's locked up. I don't need to worry anymore. They still have a lot of work to do to get over the crime. And sometimes it does involve going to meet the person who did it.
Thanks so much. Appreciate your insights.
Thank you, Lara.
Thank you, Lara. Thank you so much. So as we are moving towards a linear closure today, not wanting to take too much more of Tim's evening in Ireland, just want to offer to those of you that we may not get to with your questions. Tim, if you'd be willing, I would love to invite people to email me and maybe send you a list of questions that you can respond to after the fact, if you're willing. So the email address is rjonrise@gmail.com. And even those of you listening after the fact to the recording or watching the YouTube video, if you would like to contact us to reach out to Tim somehow with questions, we'll make sure that that gets coordinated appropriately.
Yeah, it'd be a pleasure to receive your questions. I've even the questions I've heard tonight, it's making me think, it's making me learn. I love those questions. They're really thoughtful, really, quite deep questions you're throwing at me, and I'm very thankful for that.
So I really don't want to be remiss in the top of the queue who've been very patient. And thank you, Ellen and Carolina. Both of you ask somewhat related to the facilitator role. If we could return to that for a moment, Tim. And Ellen and Carolina, given the time frame that we're in right now, if you don't mind, I'll just go ahead and summarize your questions on your behalf. Do I have your permission to do that? If you could just give me a thumbs up or something. So as far as Ellen's question, thank you. Thank you for that permission. She's asking about training facilitators. So that's kind of the first part. And then Carolina is curious about what you might feel about some of the hurdles to successful restorative justice circles.
Well,
And thank you both.
Yeah, they're again big questions. We could spend a whole web training.
Right. Maybe you could come back with us.
Yeah. Feel free to ask me. I've enjoyed this. Maybe just pick out a few things that I focus on in training. I spend a lot of time in working with people to be truly present with other people. Really, really focused, not on how am I doing, what's my performance, what am I doing next, to really sort of almost lose your ego, yourself in the process of the meeting, and to be really attuned to what's going on, because you're not distracted or not thinking about other things. And that is a skill that comes with experience and practice and hard work. But I find those sort of restorative meetings, circles, conferences, whatever you're using, when it's a bit like tonight, when the time just flies past, you say, oh, is that time already? It's because you've been lost in the process. You've been part of the process. You've been part of the collective. And there is a sort of collective energy and intelligence and creativity going on that isn't sort of thought out or planned. And there's space for spontaneity and space for the unanticipated, which I'm sure you've all experienced. Just something happens to you. Wow, I didn't see that coming, but that is amazing, what you just said. And that just is a key to opening everything up. That's what I love about this process, and love about people. If you can get it set up right, if the scaffolding's all in place, then you just don't know what might happen, but you need to be present to that possibility. And to a certain extent, it's a real willingness to leave your reality and enter into other people's realities. People who are very different from you, and to accept that they have a life and a world that is different from yours. And it's really important that you have some understanding of that and can help them negotiate their world rather than your world, which may be very different. That's a very general answer to sort of facilitation and training. I think the hurdles, the obstacles to that is when you get too self-conscious and too keen to look good and, be wise and, be the savior or the rescuer, those sort of things that our ego takes us into. I have it very much, that inclination to fix things even before I know what needs to be fixed. That sort of rushing into things with goodwill, with an eagerness, because you want to help people, you want to put things right. But I just say it's maybe not our job to put things right. It's our job to help them to put things right. It's a lot of it comes down to whether we can be part of, to use a sort of slightly ugly word, but I can't think of a better one, part of the ecosystem of the circle, as opposed to a collection of egos, if that makes any sense to you, that your ego sort of melts into the group, just temporarily, not just for that hour or 2 hours, that you lose that sort of in the center of your world and enter into other people's worlds. That's the best I can do right now.
That's really beautifully articulated. Thank you, Tim. And thank you for the question. And I'm just wondering if, Ellen, does that feel complete for you? And then for Carolina's question about, let's see, I believe it was Carolina. Bear with me. Yeah, if Tim, would you be willing, I think you may have already kind of folded in the idea of some of the challenges and prohibiting factors while I was watching for questions, so I may not have heard exactly. But is there anything that you didn't already speak to that you'd like to add around what is this idea of a successful restorative process?
Mm.
And how does that also maybe thread in the true seeing and acknowledgement of the beautiful statement that you made about relationships of power?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, in my preparation process, I would look with each party and sometimes have a bit of shuttle between the parties about the potential risks to an effective and safe process for them. And then, work with them on how we can design a process that reduces the risks and increases the resources that are required for an effective process. So I suppose the main thing I'm trying to do is to try and anticipate as many of those obstacles and concerns and things that could throw us off before we meet. And I'm using partly my own experience, but mainly their view of what the risks are and seeing them as the experts, working with them to design a process that they are happy with and that we can sort of sign off on. And so a lot of it, but things can happen. I'll tell you something that scuppered one of our meetings with the church recently. What I knew is that this guy was a multimillionaire who was the victim. He had a beautiful house in Dublin where I met him. He had a house in Indonesia. He had a house in New York. He was obviously a wealthy man. He didn't tell me about his business or anything. But when he talked about what happened to him, it was obvious that he was a deeply troubled and traumatized man. Underneath that image of wealth and confidence and power. And he also confided in me that he was addicted to cocaine and he'd been in rehab 3 times in the last 10 years. So anyway, he came for the meeting. And of course, one of the protocols that we use is you can call time out if you're getting upset or exhausted or you need just a break. And he did, and he went out and he came back. And then we went on for another while, and then he called it again, and he came back a little shaky, I thought. And then he had a third time, and then we realized he was snorting cocaine when he was out, and he was getting more and more volatile, the very opposite of what we would expect from a restorative process. And it just ended very badly. It was the one process that I would say we failed. We didn't predict, even though I knew he told me that he was dependent on cocaine. I never thought for 1 minute that he would. And I said, you need to be clean when you're at this meeting. But never thought that he would use time out to go out, and that was naive of me. So that was a major obstacle to a good process. Interestingly, I was talking to the head of the church who had been there about a month later, and we were just reviewing cases, and I said, well, that was a bad one, wasn't it? And he said, yeah, it was very hard to manage that one. But he said, he sent me a letter. And I said, no, I didn't know that. So he sent me a letter apologizing. He said as a result of that, he'd gone straight into rehab. He had money, so he said he went to a place in Mexico, and that he was feeling a lot clearer. And he'd written a letter to this guy in the hierarchy of the church to say that he was in a position to forgive the church, which was quite startling. So I think it even though it did not go as expected and would not have been seen as a successful process, something positive must have happened within him to sort of brought him to his senses, and also he was badly abused, to offer forgiveness for that, which is unusual. So it's just one thing that definitely go wrong, but we try and predict it with the participants. And that's particularly important in gender-based violence, which we haven't had enough time, as we haven't had time to really cover. But that's particularly important for people who've been abused within a relationship or sexually abused, as as mature adults, to do a really good risk assessment, and know when it's just not appropriate to go ahead.
Well, if I had the ability to add time without it extending out and keeping you, Tim, and everyone else from the rest of their afternoon or evening, I would, because this has been extraordinary, really, truly extraordinary. And thank you so much for being willing to come across the ocean. And there's others who have as well today too. So wanting to thank them, all of us, for taking time out to be in this space together. And just as kind of a closure of sorts, would you like to share anything about your research, its availability to people, and the upcoming book? And
Yeah,
then
I
I'll
mean,
have a few last words for people about where to find this online.
yeah. Well, yeah, I've as an academic, I've written quite a lot, and you can find most of my stuff if you sort of Google me on two of the academic websites, Academia and ResearchGate. You'll find articles and references to my work there. The book that I'm busily writing at the moment and hoping to get finished by April should be published, by the end of the year. And it's on my research into victims, and it's called Restorative Narratives: What You Learn If You Listen to Victims. And I'm hoping that it'll be ready to read before the end of the year, maybe a bit sooner than that. So thank you very much for your patience and your attentions with me. Thank you.
And possibly we'll get to see you in Tallinn.
I should be there.
Okay, that would be lovely. So just a warm invitation to everyone to consider coming to Europe in the latter part of May for the conference, 12th International Conference of the European Forum for Restorative Justice, called Just Times: Restorative Justice Responses in Dark Times. So you can find out more about the European Forum for Restorative Justice at euforumrj.org. And as Tim mentioned, of course, those academic spaces, Academia and ResearchGate, for all of his papers and research. And for those who didn't get a chance to have their question answered, again, please email rjonrise@gmail.com, rjonrise@gmail.com, and look out for this to drop on our iTunes collection, which is a depth of 13 years worth of restorative justice related dialogues. And we're only now touching the tip of the iceberg, and today was such a deep dive. So thank you again, Tim, for all that you are in this field, and really looking forward to staying connected with you. And thank you, everyone. You make this the community that it is. See you next time. Oh, and last thing on that note, we will be talking with Dominic Barter in the next months, as well as we have another session coming up in 2 weeks with Jabali Stewart, who is a practitioner from Seattle here in the United States. So stay tuned, please. And thank you so much.